Friedrich Hayek.
Friedrich von Hayek,
the greatest economic philosopher of the age.
How magnificent it must be to witness his ideas validated before the eyes of the world.
If there's a word we love on this channel, it's neoliberalism. Neoliberalism. It's the ism behind things like why our healthcare sucks, why so many people have shitty jobs working for Uber and DoorDash, why Russia got turbo destroyed in the 90s. It's why The Rock's Twitter bio is founder of stuff. It's a thing that matters a lot, but we've never actually spent the time to unpack what neoliberalism is in depth. And we're not going to start today. Here's someone else doing it for us.
Yeah, I mean, neoliberalism gets used in a number of different ways. So I find, as with many of these sort of ism terms, it's most helpful not to sort of decide this is the only one and true definition, but rather just sort of have a follow-up question every time someone uses the category.
This is Quinn Slobodian, a professor of international history at Boston University and the author of Crack Up Capitalism, Globalists, and the soon-to-be-released Hayek's Bastards. According to him, there are around 4 definitions.
There's kind of 4 different ways that people tend to use neoliberalism. One of the ways, I think, is to just talk about a kind of a period of global capitalism. So people will be like, when did neoliberalism begin? Was it with, the oil shocks, the closing of the gold window, Reagan and Thatcher, European Union and NAFTA, the unleashing of the tech bubble in the late 90s, or kind of the drive up of stock prices since then? I think personally, it's good to sort of drill down from there. First of all, to sort of say, all right, what are the set of policies we would expect to see to identify neoliberalism like in action in that period, 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000s? And there you'd see things like privatization of state-owned assets becoming private property. You'd see the liberalization, so moves towards free trade and the movement of capital over borders being easier, investment over borders. You would see things like deregulation, so the changing of standards and expectations on companies to make it easier for them to often concentrate and grab market share. So I think that, neoliberalism as a kind of a policy package would probably be the second way people think about it. A third way they think about it, I think, and you get this a lot kind of online maybe, especially, is being neoliberal is like a kind of a way of thinking about yourself as a kind of like a bundle of assets that can be like leveraged and maximized. So this idea of neoliberalism as like an entrepreneurship of the self is a kind of internalized logic of action. But the fourth way is to think about it as a kind of pretty discrete intellectual movement that began with a group of thinkers in the 1930s, trying to differentiate themselves from fascism and communists, as well as 19th century classical liberals like John Stuart Mill and people of that ilk. They then organized kind of formally in the 1940s in something called the Pelerin Society.
Let's stay on that last one for a minute. This is what he's talking about. What you're looking at right now is a picture from the founding meeting of the Pelerin Society, an academic group who would develop and advocate this new theory of political economy back in the 40s. Before neoliberalism had all these definitions, it was just a couple guys kicking it in Switzerland. The ski trip made it out the group chat. Let's go, dude. At the head of this organization, you had Friedrich Hayek, an Austrian economist bringing together a group of mostly academics, some journalists, and a few government officials to talk about where they wanted to see the world going. And the way they wanted to see the world going was rich people getting richer.
What are sales?
Holy bank balance! Money!
$1 billion stacked up right.
If you want to think about it in terms of how would this actually happen, like what would a neoliberal government actually do, basically, list goes, editor, do the thing, not reading all that. Now, why would anyone want the rich to get richer? See, around this time, the 30s, a pretty big contingent of conservative economists were arriving at a similar conclusion. Post-World War I, the rules of politics and capitalism had changed. Instead of kings and presidents quietly letting capitalists run free, you had new, somewhat democratically elected leaders being forced into giving their citizens a say about what countries should do with their stuff. Communists and socialists took this concept and ran with it by bringing more of the economy under direct public control and planning. Meanwhile, capitalist countries stayed afloat by doing a diluted version of something similar, holding the business owner's hand either by giving workers social services and keeping unemployment low so they wouldn't revolt, a la Keynes in the US, or beating up anyone who wasn't happy, a la Hitler and Mussolini. Now, these conservative economists in the 30s, they could tolerate Hitler and Mussolini for a minute. But they didn't like the Pandora's box that was being opened all over the world when workers and governments started getting directly involved in economic decisions.
You had sort of forms of collectivism, as they saw it, sort of fascism on the right and socialism and communism on the left. And there was a need to sort of rethink the state to protect the market from these efforts that kind of, redistributing everything a la communism and getting rid of private property, or else sort of driving the whole economy towards like war, annexation ends in the case of fascism. So neoliberalism at that point was an attempt to sort of say, how can we use the state creatively to protect market dynamics instead of to overrun or squash market dynamics?
Howdy friends, JT from the future here. I just wanted to take a quick second to do a shameless plug for Means TV, both because it's awesome and because being a dirty communist on YouTube is looking like more and more of a losing proposition. If you're not familiar with Means, it's a worker-owned cooperative and explicitly anti-capitalist streaming service. You can find everything from my videos to original series like Means Morning News to feature-length documentaries like Abby Martin's Gaza Fights for Freedom, with more amazing content being added every day. I've been working behind the scenes to help turn Means into a place that's both worthwhile for viewers as well as offering financial security for socialist creators in an increasingly reactionary political landscape. Every creator on the platform has a unique link that when anyone signs up using that link, that creator directly benefits from the subscription. I have mine in the description below, but if you really appreciate another creator's work, make sure to use their link instead. All of us at Means are trying really hard to build an alternative media ecosystem that is ideologically dedicated to sharing left-wing perspectives. With Means TV, we're able to say things the way they are. No pulling punches, no beating around the bush to trick the all-seeing eye of the algorithm. Means gives us the freedom to make the content we really want to make and say the things we really want to say. There's even a community forum where creators can engage with each other and fans right on the platform. As a little thank you for watching our channel, if you sign up with our link, or another creator's if you prefer, you can get your first month 20% off. Or for an even better deal, you can opt for the annual plan and get the whole year 20% off. A full year of Means TV will run you less than $90, which is like the cost of a single DoorDash meal these days. Every person who signs up using a creator's link is directly contributing to the financial stability of that channel and the entire cooperative media project. None of this would be possible without the generosity of viewers like you. Means TV is entirely grassroots funded, and it always will be. So if you'd like to help support our work, consider signing up for Means TV using the link below. It really does help the team here at Second Thought and dozens of principled socialist creators across the platform. Thanks for your support. All right, back to the video. You know what? Let's do something. Let's look at some cartoons. This is Hayek's most popular book, The Road to Serfdom. If you were in the US in the 40s, there's a chance this is how you would have been introduced to neoliberal thought. In a short cartoon you'd get handed at work. Or maybe like this, condensed to a few thousand words in Reader's Digest, at that point the most popular magazine in the US. In text like The Road to Serfdom, millions of Americans were exposed to the ideas of thinkers like Hayek, neoliberal thinkers who all argued for some version of the following ideas. The market is a real thing, completely separate from politics, that produces inequality, and that's a good thing. While no market is perfect, these outcomes are inevitable, like evolution or physics. The market is a fact of life, something completely separate from collective human agency. Anytime people want to organize things differently than by letting business owners call the shots, that's something called market intervention, and it's bad because there's no way to do that doesn't result in what they call tyranny. Essentially, tyranny being business owners not getting to do exactly what they want. These guys don't necessarily think being a business owner means everything going perfectly or getting everything that you desire, but they do think that business owners trying to achieve that is the only legitimate way to organize stuff being produced and distributed. Democracy is, therefore, a huge problem for neoliberals. These thinkers quite correctly figured out that, in the process of business owners calling the shots, other people weren't going to be happy working for someone else and barely making a living. In a democratic system, they might start demanding welfare, decent wages, normal hours. They might stop working to get those things. And all of that gets in the way of a few people making a quick buck by any means necessary. Instead of democracy, then, these guys started advocating for freedom.
Freedom.
As they understood it. Meaning protecting capitalists from the people they've stolen from, those they've exploited, and making sure they'd be free to keep their ill-gotten gains and continue without society's laws changing in any way that would hurt their business interests. Capitalists, entrepreneurs, business owners, whatever you call them, they all needed to be protected from people's desire for equality and fair treatment. And that also meant protecting them from national governments, who were increasingly pressured into not letting them do all that, and who had started to show off the fact that even they could replace capitalists if they needed to. But that doesn't mean neoliberals wanted small government. This is important. Unlike earlier liberals who might have said that you either have a powerful state or a powerful market, neoliberals realized that in order to protect market outcomes from democracy, the rich getting richer, you needed a new kind of state. A neoliberal state. One that will encase the capitalist economy and protect it from the rabble. But that wasn't enough. Then above the state, they wanted a system of institutions that would make sure countries would be kept in check and never succumb to democracy. Institutions which would codify into international law the rights of investors and then actually enforce them by punishing countries who didn't put profit first.
Yeah, I mean, I think the most common error, which incredibly sort of comes up decade after decade, is this idea that neoliberalism means the kind of withdrawing of the state and the kind of triumph of an unfettered market. So just private actors operating in a kind of anarchic state of self-organization. Actually, this has never been the case. So if you're describing the policies of someone like Margaret Thatcher or Ronald Reagan or Bill Clinton, then what they're doing is not actually taking the state out of the market. They're actually not rolling back the state only, they're also rolling out a new kind of state. So for example, people might talk about free trade or the 90s and 2000s as an era of unfettered markets. But that was also a time where you got like literally tens of thousands of new bilateral investment treaties, new forms of arbitration, new forms of investor-state dispute settlement arrangements. So actually what's called free or unfettered trade is actually super thick with different kinds of laws, agreements being made between states. The difference is that there are agreements and laws being made primarily to protect a certain kind of a market against any attempt to kind of interfere with it or produce different kind of redistributive outcomes.
And you can literally see the application of this framework right now, like in Honduras.
Billionaires are pouring money into this private city.
They were given the right to take a kind of patch of territory in an island north of the main part of Honduras and to write their own laws, to create their own regulations, to have their own court system. This happened under an authoritarian government about 10 years ago. And with the change of government, the new democratically elected government is like, we don't want this anymore. Get out of here, you Silicon Valley tech bros. Like, our sovereignty is not for sale.
Communities are fighting back against privatization and foreign exploitation.
And the response of the hyper-libertarian Silicon Valley investors has been to turn to free trade agreements and bilateral investment treaties to sue the state of Honduras for $10.8 billion.
But now that we know what neoliberalism is, what it looks like, and why it matters, how did we actually get here? Honestly, a lot of things can explain neoliberalism. For governments, the neoliberal idea became incredibly important around the 70s and 80s. If you'll remember, that's when Reagan and Thatcher get into power and they start applying the neoliberal rulebook that they get from institutes like the Heritage Foundation, one of the many spiritual children of the Mont Pelerin Society. More about Heritage here if you're interested. Anyway, Reagan is literally handed a checklist on how to do neoliberalism, and immediately sets out going down the list, crushing the institutions that make society more equal, fair, and safe, and giving more leeway to companies to screw around, monopolize, and buy state assets for cheap, while putting all the government's energy into protecting them from repercussions. And that was allowed to happen partly because the Keynesian alternative of welfare and full employment was weakening.
There was a kind of impasse in the 1970s related to American overspending on things like especially their overseas commitment, the Vietnam War, the effects of the oil crisis when the cost of oil quadrupled in the early 70s and thus suddenly made it much harder to keep things like heavy industry functioning in a place like the American Midwest. So there was a kind of a collapse of certain kinds of manufacturing in the US and the UK and Germany, which produced a sense of anger, discontent. People felt like their rights as workers to be upwardly mobile and have unions represent their interests were being trampled on, and they were. So there was both a wave of strikes and then a wave of strike breaking that happened in the 70s that kind of shattered the social contract that had prevailed, arguably, after the Second World War.
That's what was happening domestically. But a big part of the explanation for neoliberalism undoubtedly has to be decolonization. After World War II, a bunch of countries put a stop to the West's direct control over them and their resources. People all over the world formed new governments in popular revolutions, taking power away from colonial empires, and in many cases, they decided to nationalize the industries, the forests, the mines, all the stuff that was formerly owned by the West. For neoliberal thinkers, this was a crisis. A world where the wealthy, especially wealthy Westerners, weren't free to do everything and own whatever, wherever, but actually had to negotiate with democratic institutions, and sometimes getting told no meant less power and profits for the elite. They couldn't just impose colonialism back on the countries who had just freed themselves, though, so neoliberalism came up with a compromise. They would let decolonized countries have their independence, their flags, their seat at the UN, their own government whose leaders were barely even assassinated and replaced by the CIA, but in exchange, they would have to sign a couple treaties and join the WTO, the World Bank, and the IMF. A whole new set of international institutions who would hold every country to the, quote, same standards, and create a global economy where everyone followed the same rules. Never mind that some countries had a head start, or that the rules weren't really applying to us. Neoliberals basically just wanted decolonization without economic autonomy. They wanted to bring into the real world their idea that the economy is not something you can mess with as a regular person. Everyone was to be put under the boot of global capital. And they did it. They sort of won. While neoliberals do disagree with each other, the sorts of policies that became associated with neoliberalism have popped up almost everywhere. Things like the EU were born within neoliberal foundations, and international law is now dominated by the kinds of capitalist rules neoliberals dreamt up in the 30s and 40s. It's not that everyone's become a neoliberal, that's not the case. Already in the 90s, as all this is crystallizing, people knew what this project could bring, and they fought back. Not every politician elected went all in for neoliberalism. And even today, with guys like Milei in Argentina proudly waving the neoliberal flag, many elected leaders are explicitly anti-neoliberal, like Claudia Sheinbaum in Mexico. But neoliberal thinking has become a baseline against which alternatives now have to be compared. Neoliberals haven't taken over the government, but they do have an outsized voice. They don't have a secret plan, but they have been putting a lot of effort into getting politicians on their side, Trump being one of them. His biggest accomplishments, like the 2017 tax cuts that only made the rich richer, were a direct product of Reagan's economic advisors Arthur Laffer, Stephen Moore, and Heritage. His current Treasury Secretary, just a year ago, was writing this for the Manhattan Institute, in pretty clear terms saying it was time to make neoliberalism more aggressive. The good thing is that none of this is permanent. While it's not over yet, there is an expiration date on neoliberalism. When capital has consumed all its available frontiers, when it's tapped its resources dry, when it's ripped the wires from the wall, it's only a matter of time. The bogus international system of rules and norms is on its last legs. Neoliberal regimes are fiercely unpopular. No amount of revisionist history will change the fact that neoliberalism was, and remains, an ideology whose sole purpose is to enrich the already obscenely wealthy. It's time for neoliberalism to go. And it's not the oligarchs or their political lackeys who are going to make that happen.